Hey there, deep divers. We've got a really fascinating deep dive for you all today. And before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor for today. This deep dive is brought to you by personalityquizzes.com. You can go there to take a free attachment style test. It's a great way to kind of see where you fall on the spectrum, um, the secure, anxious, and avoidant dimensions, and maybe get a little bit more insight into your relationships. Speaking of relationships, are you ready to take a deep dive into the complex world of anxious, avoidant relationships?
I am. I think this is such a fascinating topic and one that a lot of people can relate to.
It is. It is. I mean, so many people write in with questions about this particular dynamic. And today we're going to use a real life story
Yeah.
to sort of unpack what's going on in these relationships. And then, of course, we're going to analyze it through the lens of attachment theory.
Mm.
So to kick things off, let's meet our protagonist. She's chosen the online alias Luna to protect her privacy. But essentially, she's sharing her story online seeking advice because she's trying to make sense of her relationship struggles. And it all starts in a bustling coffee shop where Luna first meets Dante. Right away, their energies are complete opposites. Her mind's racing with thoughts, and he's got this quiet, almost reserved demeanor. But somehow those differences, they initially feel like they fit together,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, it's funny how that happens, right? It's like we're often drawn to what we perceive as missing in ourselves. Like in this case, Luna might be drawn to Dante's calmness, and he might admire her openness and expressiveness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They embark on this whirlwind of long walks and deep conversations. It's a feeling of like two worlds intertwining. It's a classic honeymoon phase, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But as their relationship progresses, some cracks start to show. Luna finds herself needing more reassurance. She's texting and calling more frequently, always kind of seeking validation. And Dante, on the other hand, he starts needing more space. His replies become less frequent, and he just seems to pull back a little.
It sounds like we're starting to see some of those ingrained patterns of relating emerge here. You know those attachment styles we talk about?
Right. Because attachment styles are kind of like those hidden blueprints that shape how we approach intimacy and connection.
Exactly. And it's really helpful to define these styles early on so we can understand what's happening in this dynamic.
Okay, so let's talk about those attachment styles.
Okay, so think of it as a spectrum. On one end, we have the secure attachment style, and these are the folks who are generally pretty comfortable with both intimacy and independence. They can express their needs clearly, offer support, navigate conflict constructively. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the anxious and avoidant styles. And these are the ones that often end up in that push and pull dynamic that we were just talking about.
Okay, so I'm already seeing how this might apply to Luna and Dante. So her anxiety about Dante pulling away, is that a classic sign of an anxious attachment style?
It could be. People with an anxious attachment style often crave a lot of closeness and reassurance. And they're very sensitive to any shifts in their partner's behavior. They might worry about being abandoned or not being loved enough.
And what about Dante needing space? Does that point towards an avoidant attachment style?
It very well could. Individuals with an avoidant style tend to really value their independence, and they can feel uncomfortable with too much closeness, so they might withdraw or shut down emotionally when things get intense. And it's not because they don't care, it's more that they have a harder time processing and expressing their feelings openly.
So we're basically seeing that classic anxious avoidant clash here, with Luna seeking closeness and Dante needing space. And I'm guessing this all kind of comes to a head with a defining argument, right?
Yes, it does, and that's where things start to get really interesting. So why don't we take a closer look at that argument and see how these attachment styles play out in a real-life conflict?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so we've got Luna and Dante. They've been dating for a few weeks now, and they're in this push and pull dynamic. And then what happens?
Well, after weeks of this kind of back and forth, Dante mentions needing some me time, after what Luna thought was a really great date.
Oh boy, I can see where this is going.
Yeah, it's like someone just flipped a switch. That seemingly innocent request for space, it can totally send someone with an anxious attachment style into a spiral of worry and overthinking.
Oh yeah, for sure. She's probably rereading texts and questioning everything. And that fear of abandonment, it really starts to take hold.
Exactly. And meanwhile, Dante's over there feeling suffocated, and his urge to withdraw just intensifies.
It's like they're speaking two completely different languages when it comes to expressing their needs.
You got it. And that's the big challenge with these anxious avoidant pairings. Their instinctive reactions to stress and emotional intimacy are almost like polar opposites. It's like they're wired for a different kind of connection. And without understanding those underlying patterns, it can lead to so much hurt and miscommunication.
And that's exactly what happens, right?
Oh, yeah.
They have this huge blow-up argument. Accusations are flying. You can almost feel the pain and frustration on both sides. You don't care enough. You're smothering me. It's like a classic communication breakdown fueled by all those attachment-based anxieties.
And it's so important to remember that neither person is inherently wrong or bad here. They're both just reacting based on their own ingrained patterns of relating. Like, Luna's anxiety isn't a sign of weakness, and Dante's need for space isn't a sign of him being callous or uncaring. It's about understanding where those reactions are coming from and learning to communicate more effectively.
And that's where I think the silver lining comes in. Because instead of just throwing in the towel, they both kind of take a step back and realize that they're caught in this really painful cycle. They both genuinely care about each other, but they need a new approach.
That moment of self-awareness is so important. It's really the first step towards breaking free from those automatic reactions.
So what happens next?
Well, Luna and Dante, they decide to do some research. They start reading up on attachment theory.
It's like they're finally getting a glimpse behind the curtain. They're seeing the script they've been unknowingly following all along.
Exactly. And that knowledge can be so powerful. Luna starts to recognize her own anxious tendencies. She starts to understand that her fear of abandonment might be coming from past experiences, maybe from caregivers who weren't consistently emotionally available when she was younger. And Dante, he begins to see his need for space not as rejection, but as kind of a defense mechanism, a way of managing those big feelings that might feel overwhelming to him.
It's amazing how those early childhood experiences can really shape our attachment styles and then play out in our adult relationships. But just understanding those patterns, that's only half the battle, right?
Right.
They have to actually change their behavior.
Exactly. Awareness without action isn't going to lead to lasting change.
So what do they do?
Well, this is what I find really inspiring about their story. They actually start putting some practical strategies into place to help them bridge those differences. They decide to schedule dedicated us time to really nurture their connection, and me time to honor Dante's need for space. It's about creating a structure that works for both of them.
So they're essentially rewriting the script of their relationship, one scene at a time.
I love that analogy. It's not about magically erasing those differences. It's about learning to dance with them, finding a rhythm that works for both partners.
But I imagine even with the best intentions, those old patterns can still creep back in.
Oh, absolutely. Even with all the us time and me time in the world, Luna's anxieties and Dante's need for space, they could still trigger conflicts.
So how do they navigate those challenges? What other strategies do they use?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll see how Luna and Dante deal with those lingering patterns and what they do to build a more secure and fulfilling connection.
All right, so we're back and we're talking about those inevitable bumps in the road, even when you think you've got a handle on those attachment styles.
It's so true. Those old patterns, they have a way of sneaking up on you.
So tell me more about these missteps that Luna and Dante experience. Like, what happens after they start implementing the us time and the me time?
Well, picture this. They decide to go to an art exhibit. Sounds pretty neutral and relaxing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But as they're walking around, Dante gets really quiet. He's just kind of lost in thought processing the art. But for Luna, his silence is a major trigger.
I bet. Her mind is probably going a mile a minute, and those fears of abandonment come rushing back.
Exactly. She tries to talk about how she's feeling. But Dante's response is something like, I'm just taking it all in. I'm not ignoring you. And it just doesn't land the way he intended.
Yeah, I can see that.
To Luna, it feels dismissive, like he doesn't care.
It's like, even with the best intentions, they're still miscommunicating.
Exactly. And this is where those additional strategies come in.
Right, because they've already started with the scheduled us time and me time. But it sounds like they need to add some more tools to their relationship toolbox.
Exactly. So they start experimenting with things like scheduled emotional check-ins, where Luna has a dedicated time to express her feelings and needs without feeling like she's overwhelming Dante.
That's a great idea.
They also set boundaries around texting, making sure that Dante has the space he needs to respond in a genuine way, without triggering Luna's fear of being ignored.
So it's all about fine-tuning their communication, learning how to speak each other's emotional languages.
You got it. And that's crucial for any relationship, but it's especially important when you're dealing with that anxious avoidant dynamic.
It's about acknowledging those fundamental differences in how you approach connection, and then finding ways to bridge the gap.
Exactly.
So what's the takeaway here? Are Luna and Dante destined for a happily ever after?
Well, relationships are complicated. We don't have all the answers, but their story shows us how powerful self-awareness can be. and communication and the willingness to adapt and try new things.
It's a hopeful message. It shows us that understanding our attachment styles and our partner's attachment styles can really help us build stronger and more fulfilling relationships.
And it's not about erasing those differences. It's about learning to appreciate them and finding ways to work together.
And remember, this isn't just about romantic relationships. It applies to all kinds of relationships in our lives, with friends, family members, even colleagues.
Absolutely.
Understanding attachment theory can help us navigate all sorts of connections.
And if you're curious to learn more about your own attachment style, I highly recommend checking out our sponsor for today's deep dive, personalityquizzes.com.
They have a free attachment style test you can take. It's a great starting point for self-discovery.
It really is.
Well, that brings our deep dive into the world of anxious avoidant relationships to a close. We've talked about the challenges, the triggers, and most importantly, the strategies for building healthier connections. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those questions coming.